Things Podcast. Hey, Phantomaniacs, welcome to the newest episode of the Needless Things Podcast, where we talk about toys, movies, music, and all manner of pop culture dorkery. I'm your host, Dave, and today's episode is going to be all about music, and music is a very important thing to me. It's part of the reason why I mention it in the intro, and I have a concept for an episode that is even more focused or I guess themed towards music, but it's going to require a little more time to put together than I'd expected. So today I'm going to be talking about sort of the music of my life. I'm going to be going back to my earliest memories of music and just going through my own sort of personal history of being a fan of music and discovering different types and kinds, and the experiences that being a music fan have brought into my life. But before I get into that, I want to tell you that this coming Monday, June 3rd, I had to stop and think about that for a second, but that is correct, June the 3rd, at the Seven Stages Theater in Little Five Points, as part of the Atlanta Fringe Festival, myself, Mr. Bo Brown, and Matt Nitchie will be performing 1/5 of The Princess Bride as part of a very special event that's part of the Atlanta Fringe Festival called 5/5 of The Princess Bride. We have been working on this thing for a couple of months now. I am very excited. It's different from anything else I've ever done. The opportunity to work with Bo and Matt is very exciting. You may know them as the Sci-Fi Janitors. You know Mr. Bo Brown as the man behind the Dragon Con puppetry track, as well as all kinds of interviews and people I've spoken to on this show. It's hugely exciting, and it's going to be so much fun. You guys, I'm sitting here wanting to tell you the whole thing right now, and obviously I cannot do that. You're going to have to wait for Monday, June 3rd at Seven Stages Theater in Little Five Points. You can go on Facebook and look up 5/5 of Princess Bride. You can go to atlantafringefest.com, I believe is the address, although you know how to Google. Look up Atlanta Fringe Festival, and you will find the whole deal there. I also, before we get into the episode proper, I want to tell you about sidewalktoys.com. They now have a storefront in Odin's Comics in Lilburn, Georgia, and this place is great. You can find them on Facebook. The sidewalktoys.com will actually take you to the Facebook page, but the in stock, like in person, they have 112 Collective, releases from NECA, Marvel Legends, like basically all the cool toys that we cover on needlessthingspodcast.com and here on the show. When we talk about toys, you can get through sidewalktoys.com. He does pre-orders. But the cool thing to me is you can walk right in and see stuff like the 112 Collective figures in person. He's got a display case full of them, and you don't have to just order them sight unseen online like you typically have to do. But like I said, he also has a current selection of NECA, like the Aliens and Predator figures, the forthcoming Candyman figure that's coming out, and full Marvel Legends, Funko, a little bit of everything. And it's all current stuff. Like Target, for example, that carries the NECA toys, still hasn't received the most recent, or at least none of the Targets in my area have received the most recent Aliens series, and he's had it in there for like a month now. He gets his stuff direct from the companies, and it's all MSRP. You're not going in there and paying a specialty store markup. When you go in, if the MSRP for a 112 Collective figure is $75, he's selling it for $75. It's fantastic. It's really a great experience walking in there, talking to Ishman, who's the guy that runs Sidewalk Toys. And I love having a place to go for toys like that again. It's great because it seems to me that the NECA experience at Target might be sort of falling through. I don't know what's going on with that. But fewer and fewer Targets seem to actually have NECA products, and they certainly don't seem to be getting new items in. So, it's great to have this alternative. So sidewalktoys.com, go check them out. And every single week, new stuff coming in, and you can pre-order through them as well. So there you go. Great stuff. New friend to the show. I'm very excited. Moving on, I think I've done I made a few weeks ago, I was like, I want to put over stuff more regularly on the show, and I feel pretty good. Granted, one of those things I'm part of, but, what are you going to do? So let's talk about music a little bit. I love music, and it's always weird to me when I run into somebody who isn't quite as passionate about music as I am. Like, oh, yeah, I listen to the radio, or yeah, I just put on whatever's on Spotify, or... It's odd to me that somebody wouldn't have a collection of thousands of CDs, or wouldn't know like every album of specific bands, or it's just something from a very early age that I just loved it, and it's because of my parents that I do. Both of my parents are huge music fans. My dad had a very large collection of records when I was young, and I didn't listen to, on my own. Obviously, when I was very young, I didn't have permission to touch any of them, but at one point, I started having my own records, and the first ones I remember being specifically mine were some of the Muppets records that came out, with music from the Muppet Show, the Muppet movie soundtrack. Those were the ones. That was some of the first music that I think of as mine. Those albums were bought for me, and that I could go and put them on the record player myself. And this was an old school. Obviously, this was late 70s, early 80s. My memories after we moved to Georgia in 81 are a little more distinct. But it was the same wood grain turntable with the big. They all seem to have that sort of smoky plastic top on them, or at least all the ones I've had. Even the one I've got right now, that's a much more modern turntable, has that same smoky plastic, although it's covered in stickers from rock bands that I've gotten over the years. But the big, I think Technics maybe turntable, and I was eventually, when I got old enough to know how to handle records properly, I would be able to go and put that Muppets record, on the turntable myself. But those weren't. That's not even where the love came from, because some of my fondest music memories, even at this point, having been to countless shows, having worked in music clubs, owning. However many hours of music I own now, some of my favorite music memories are of our road trips as a family, because like I said, we relocated from Gastonia, North Carolina to Norcross, Georgia in 1981. And my family, though, like everybody except for myself, my parents, and later my sister, but all my grandparents, aunts, uncles, all that kind of stuff, were in Wilmington, North Carolina. And we went up there a lot. My mom was very, very close to her parents, my granny and papa. And we would travel up there basically every time that we could. We weren't up there every weekend or anything, but if it was a long weekend, we were probably going up there. We went up there for a couple of weeks every single summer, maybe twice during the summer. I know sometimes just my mom and I would go up there, and my dad would, stay at home to work, because you can't just take vacation all the time. But that was where we went. Those were our trips. Those were our vacations, and I loved it that way. But on those road trips in the car, my dad had all of these mixtapes that he had made. Some of them were mixtapes, and some of them were just straight up recordings of records. He would record everything onto cassette tapes so we could listen to them in the car. And it's funny to think back to that, and that he did. He's obviously the first person I know of that was doing that, making these buying it on vinyl and recording it onto cassette. It's not, until I was talking about it just now, isn't that an interesting thing that instead of just listening to the radio, he wanted to have that stuff with him? And I don't know, I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old at the time. And I don't know if that was something that everybody was doing, if that was common practice, if that was like the hot new technology. I'm honestly not sure what the status was on that. But I remember he had these cases of dozens of cassettes, and each one labeled with every song that was on it. He didn't just put it on the cassette and know that this is, Rolling Stones or whatever. Each song that was on there, even if he was just recording the album straight to the cassette, it would have every song title listed on that white folding insert that went into the cassette tape case. But the oldies were it for me when we were on those road trips. We would listen to the American Graffiti soundtrack, all kinds of compilations of music from the 50s and the 60s, the stuff that my parents grew up listening to. Just like it's crazy to me to think that now, in 2019, the music of 1989 that I was listening to when I was 13 years old is the equivalent of music from 1951 that we were listening to in 1981. Like, how crazy is that? That's wild. So it blows my mind. It really just blows my mind how the time passes, and as we get older, how much faster it passes. I don't like thinking about the fact that at this point in my life, all the music I loved so much are the equivalent of the oldies I was listening to when I was a little kid, but that's how it is. But yeah, that you had the American Graffiti soundtrack with Wolfman Jack, so every single song on there is just ingrained into my brain, and to this day I still have a copy of that that we'll listen to from time to time when we're traveling. So that's kind of where it started, is those road trips. I mean, when we were in the car, we were listening to music, even just driving around town. Always there was Fox 97 was the oldies station. As a matter of fact, my cousin JJ Jackson was a DJ for Fox 97 for years and years, and he did I think the Sunday morning show. But Fox 97 was a huge deal in Atlanta in the 80s, and they played what people that were my age now back then wanted to listen to. And it bums me out a little bit that radio kind of isn't a thing anymore. I couldn't even tell you the last time I listened to a radio station. I really can't, because we'll get to how radio evolved as well. I'll talk about that a little bit, but for now I'm going to stick to my own personal musical journey. So those vinyl records, playing them at home, the Muppets, and then gradually getting stuff like, I remember my mom bringing home the Beverly Hills Cop soundtrack, and I remember getting Men at Work, Cargo, and pop music entered into it. Michael Jackson's Thriller, obviously, we had that. Every home in America had that, which kind of sidetracks me off to something else a little bit, in that, back then, you had a few TV channels, you had a few radio stations, and everybody was kind of listening to the same thing. And this is something we discussed in depth on an older episode of the Needless Things podcast. If you can scroll through the covers, I can't look up the episode right now, but it had Taylor Swift and Hulk Hogan, and it was about 80s pop culture, and if it was even possible for a person, a celebrity, to be as big now as they were in the 80s. Because back then, everybody was kind of on the same page. We all, like, my mom knew who Whitney Houston was. Like, everybody, to a certain extent, was watching and listening to mostly the same things. And that's not to say there wasn't a fringe, and that's not to say There weren't independent artists out there doing their thing, but we were kind of all on the same track. And I don't want to sound too old fogey-ish, but is that part of why it's so easy for people to be separated and splintered now, is because it is so easy to immerse yourself in your own thing, and there are too many options available, so you just kind of go off and do your own thing, and you don't have that communication anymore, and you don't have those common pop culture touchstones anymore. But that's an episode that, well, like I said, we have already covered to a certain extent and probably could be revisited again another day. So radio is huge. I started getting into pop music thanks to MTV. That was the huge thing. Michael Jackson was it. He was the biggest name in the world. Everything he did was huge. For years, music videos, from Thriller to Bad. I remember the first time, and this sounds crazy, I remember the first time I saw the video for Beat It. Now, I can't tell you what's so special about Beat It. I really can't. I don't know why it got me as a kid. I know that they were dressed cool. If you go and watch that video, that it's funny because I see complaints now about when something like Stranger Things embraces that retro look. Which Stranger Things is a bad example because in general they do a pretty good job of it. Like how those kids dress is how I was dressing in the 80s. It's not too exaggerated. But sometimes when movies or TV try to embrace an 80s aesthetic, they embrace not what the people were wearing, but what the stars, what the music videos showed, what the movies showed, which was not entirely genuine. And that's when you look at something like Michael Jackson's Beat It and the way that they're dressed in that video, you know, that's what was being presented. That was the ideal. When you're a kid, and you see people dressed with the cut-off T-shirts and the spiked leather, not spiked, studded leather wristbands and the headbands and the big hair and the tight parachute pants and all that kind of stuff. Like that was, there were people that dressed like that for sure. Don't let anybody tell you different. Every kid in my school at some point had a pair of parachute pants. That was not uncommon or outrageous in any way. You didn't dress like that every day. Maybe you got one pair, TJ Maxx off season a year later, but you had them and you wore them every once in a while. Well, once a week probably, as often as your mother would let you. But mostly it was jeans and the striped, polo shirt type deal. Licensed T-shirts and stuff weren't as big a thing back then. At least for me, they weren't. I didn't have any. The only G.I. Joe shirt I had was one that I got, like a G.I. Joe magazine that came with an iron-on of the G.I. Joe logo, and my mom ironed it on a T-shirt for me. But I didn't have like Mr. T shirts and Transformers shirts, and like that just wasn't as prevalent then as it is now. But we're not talking about 80s pop culture. We're talking about music. But I got a little off track, which I'm bound to do from time to time during this episode because there's so many memories and so many portions of my life so intricately and intimately tied into music. But yeah, pop music, it was huge. In the 80s, everybody was listening to what was on MTV, what was on Top 40 radio, and I was no different. And Michael Jackson absolutely was probably the first celebrity, aside from Kermit the Frog, that I really was aware of how big and important they were. And you may sort of roll your eyes at the idea of referring to a pop culture icon or a musician as important, but they were important. Michael Jackson made huge cultural changes in America specifically, but really across the globe. So I was aware of him. Once I discovered Prince, I liked his music a little more, but I wasn't as comfortable listening to it because I could tell there was something a little more salacious and a little more, obviously I wouldn't have known what sexy was at the time, but, Prince in the bathtub, it gave me a feeling of, should I even be watching this? And it was, it's just on MTV. It's in the middle of a block of videos, but definitely a little uncomfortable. If Mom walked in right now, that wouldn't be cool. So it took me a few years before I really embraced Prince in the way that I do now. Michael Jackson was my guy, but then, and I mentioned Beat It, seeing that video and the dancing and just how cool he seemed to be walking around with all these tough dudes. And that guitar riff also. Enough can't be said about the cool guitar riff in Beat It. So that video was just massive. And honestly, MTV, the role of MTV in my musical life can't be underplayed either, because that is where I discovered almost everything. Radio, like I said, on the road trips and stuff, we were listening to Fox 97, so I wasn't discovering anything new in the oldies. And look, I loved those oldies, and I love them now still. There's so much sweetness in that music, and there's also some really cool, dirty rock and roll from that era. But you're not going to make any current discoveries listening to that kind of stuff. So MTV, which I was able to watch on my own at home, was where I found my music. So next up for me was Weird Al and seeing the video for Eat It. And again, I remember, I have the feelings still from the first time I saw that video for Eat It. What is happening? Who is this guy? Why is this is funny, but why is he doing this? Can you do this? It's Michael Jackson's song, but he's saying eat it, and he's talking about kids are starving in Japan, and he's doing all the dances and stuff, but it's silly. Oh, look, he's tying the wrists together, but they have a knife and a fork, or a couple of forks or whatever, a fork and a spoon maybe. What is... I was baffled and enchanted at the same time, which honestly, all of my favorite things, that's generally my initial reaction to them, is a complete lack of understanding, but an inexplicable attraction to them. So through Eat It, once again on MTV, I discovered Weird Al. The first Weird Al cassette I bought with my own money was Polka Party. But I think I had in 3D prior to that. I can't actually remember beyond the first two cassettes I bought with my very own money, which I'll get to in a second. I don't really remember my cassette collection all that well, or how the progression went. But so Weird Al, the first music I got into, I would say, and made my own decision that I was going to like. Because Michael Jackson, everybody loved Michael Jackson back then. That wasn't, like, you saw Michael Jackson, he was everywhere, and everybody had Thriller, and it was just a thing, and there was no not liking him, there was no making the decision to like him, he just was. Very much like Tom King's recent Miracle Man comic kept the repetition of Dark Side is, Michael Jackson is. And that's just how that was. Weird Al was the first musical artist that I made a conscious decision that I was a fan and that I liked it. But between getting that Weird Al cassette, because now that I'm talking about it, I think I was actually surprised to discover that Weird Al had albums. My thinking maybe early on was that he just did these funny parody videos, and that was it. Because I want to say Like a Surgeon, maybe, was the next one that I saw. But thinking back, I think it was a surprise to me to discover that Weird Al had actual albums available. And so prior to buying Polka Party, that first album, and I think I bought it when it was relatively new, I discovered Run DMC. And the video, again, MTV, Walk This Way, changed my life. Because, again, guitar riffs, very important. And Walk This Way, featuring Aerosmith, that confrontation between the two of them with the eventual resolution, and they're playing on stage together. It's such a cool, fun, very, very 80s video. At the time, I didn't know who Aerosmith was. I had no idea. It was a Run DMC. Actually, and again, as I'm telling you guys these things, it's all coming back to me. So, watching that video, I believe I had some familiarity with Run DMC, but at the very least, it was clear that Walk This Way was their music video. They're the protagonists, if you will. And I thought that Joe Perry and Steven Tyler, who were in the video with Run DMC, I thought they were just some white guys for hire that were playing a rock band that were part of Run DMC's video. Like, it was the narrative. Run DMC's trying to chill out and be cool and you know, do their cool black guy thing, and these annoying white generic rock and roll guys are next door making a bunch of noise. It's hilarious to realize that I had no idea who Aerosmith were at the time. I didn't know that Steven Tyler and Joe Perry were anybody of note. I literally thought they were just hired for that video. So, Walk This Way, I absolutely loved it. And Fight for Your Right to Party, I think, was right around the same time. But I do know for sure that the first two cassettes I bought with my own allowance money were Run DMC Raising Hell and Beastie Boys License to Ill. And those two cassettes very much set the tone for the next, you know, decade of my life. Not that I was going to run out and roll myself a Wooler and get a lyrics I'm not even going to try, but you know what I mean. It's not like I was trying to ape those lifestyles. It's not like I even understood most of what the Beastie Boys and Run DMC were talking about. I didn't, and it's funny now. You know, on Raising Hell, there are a couple of instances of profanity. There's I think one or two uses of the N-word at the very end of the album, which was shocking to me at the time. But those cassettes got played over and over and over and over again. Not obviously. I think one time I tried to play Raising Hell for my parents. I don't know what I know what I was thinking. When you're a little kid, you are enthusiastic about things and you want to share that enthusiasm with your parents, with your family, and you're not thinking about how your parents are going to receive things. You just know, I'm so excited about this thing, and you know, I can't wait to share it and to see that excitement reflected back at me. And unfortunately, when you're a kid, what you're excited about is probably pretty different from what your parents might be excited about, to the point where it may be inaccessible. And I've learned this, having an 11-year-old son. I try to be as cool as I can. Not cool as in like cool and hip, but cool as in understanding of his interests and try to show as much interest as I possibly can. But there are some things that he's really into that I just don't get. And looking back, I see those times when I'd be like, "Oh, Dad, check this out." And it would get the old, "Huh." I feel that, "Huh." And I try to never, ever express it, but I understand it. So, back in the day, how I listened to cassettes was originally on a silver Sony Walkman. Now, if you don't know, and you probably do, because I would imagine the average listener of this show is probably old enough to at least be aware of the Sony Walkman, if not to have actually owned one. But the first one I had, a silver Sony Walkman, it was all metal, and it had a very thin panel that opened up, and you put the cassette, I believe the cassette actually slid into the panel that opened and then pushed into place. And then I had the earphones that came with it. We didn't upgrade earphones back then. You just used whatever came with the player that you got. So the first earphones I had were a thin metal strip with the padded foam earphones that didn't cover your ear plugged into it. So on that, I listened to the copies of the Men at Work albums, Michael Jackson albums, that my dad had recorded from the records that we owned. I listened to that Beastie Boys and Run DMC over and over and over again. And real quick, I want to mention another one that I absolutely wore out, and that is the 1990, so I would have been 14 years old, the 1990 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles soundtrack. That is another one that I remember listening to over and over again. Absolutely loved it. Turtle Power, one of the greatest movie songs of all time. That's by Partners in Crime. That's Crime. I believe it's with a K-R-Y-M-E, and it might even be, that might even stand for something, but I'm not sure. But that was another huge album that I loved. Fat Boys. I had a Fat Boys cassette. I am trying now to think back to my collection of cassettes. I know there were a few that I wanted to upgrade, but you had to make big decisions then. Like I had Thriller recorded from the record onto a cassette. But see, when you've got that and you've got your cassette box that you travel around with, you don't feel as cool pulling out that TDK cassette with the songs written on it, on the insert, as you do pulling out the actual cassette of Thriller with the album cover, and on the side is Michael Jackson Thriller. Like there's a cool factor to having the actual cassette. Sound quality wise, I bet it didn't matter a bit. But cool factor wise, there were times when I just wanted to upgrade that cassette and or upgrade to that cassette, because you got to have your music everywhere you go, and I did. Whether it was Boy Scouts, whether it was trips, whether it was going somewhere with the church youth group, I always had my Walkman. Now, later on, I upgraded to the Sony Sport Walkman when it came out. What this was a yellow plastic probably not waterproof, probably water resistant. Everything was rounded. It seemed very cool and C-Lab, like there were no corners on it. It was all rounded edges, and there was a black rubber gasket between the tray. And now that I'm talking about it, I remember that first silver Walkman, the panel opened up, you put the cassette in and closed the panel. It was the Sport Walkman I had, where I believe you actually put the cassette in the door and then it pushed into place. But it had a black gasket around where the door closed. There was black rubber on all the buttons. There were little tabs, or there was a little tab that pushed into where you put the headphone jack. A little rubber circle with a plug that stuck in there when you weren't using it. It just seemed so cool at the time. I never got it anywhere near water at all. It was purely bought for the look of that sport Walkman. I don't even like the color yellow. But that was the thing at the time. Everybody upgraded to those Sony Sport Walkmans when that happened. It's funny. The Star-Lord, the Walkman that he has, there you go. That's our touchstone right there for the Walkman. Star-Lord's Walkman in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. No Walkman I remember ever looked like that. That blue and orange Walkman. It's neat, and design-wise it probably reflects something, but those colors were just not something that existed in that point in time. But that's okay, because you know what else didn't exist at that point in time? Talking raccoons from outer space and men with red mohawks who could control a dart with their whistling. Those things also did not exist in the 80s, so we're going to let that slide. So the cassettes were just huge, and I bought that Weird Al Polka Party cassette, and that was how I got, I still listened to the radio, because radio was a constant presence, and when I'm, in the car or whatever with my parents, we're listening to, as I said, Fox 97, and MTV constantly introducing me to new things, and the pop music of the 80s. Now, Madonna, obviously I wanted to watch every Madonna video that came on. Every single time one came on, no matter how many times I'd seen it, I would watch it again. She was the coolest, but things were different back then. And being a 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever year-old boy and being super into Madonna probably wouldn't have been cool. Actually, another memory that popped into my head just now, speaking of maybe not being cool, I love Duran Duran. Mainly because of A View to a Kill. The fact that they made a song for a James Bond movie made them some of the coolest people in the world. So I went through a Duran Duran phase for a while, and I actually had a Duran Duran poster up on my wall of them in these nice 80s looking suits with their makeup on and their fancy hair, and basically looking like a bunch of sexy bitches. And my dad hated that poster. I can't even imagine. And look, when I'll be talking about my parents a little bit as I go through these memories, and you got to understand, they were born in the mid 40s. And as they were growing up, America was a certain way. And you don't hold people's eras and lives against them. They can grow and they can evolve, but it's ruthless and ignorant to hold somebody from another era to the standards of today throughout their life. And that's something that people seem to do right now, and I think it's horrible. And I certainly don't do that to my parents. So, having said that, I am fairly certain that the pop culture stylings of the 80s and some of the things that I enjoyed made my dad absolutely positive that I was gay. And that Duran Duran poster, I think there was he probably went into work and was kind of asking around, like, do you know about this Duran Duran business? A bunch of gay boys in suits making music. Well, Tom, they did the music for the James Bond movie. I mean, that's pretty cool, right? I guess so. And over the years, I think about the difficulties my dad has had in adjusting to times changing, and he has. He is not a bigoted or prejudiced person. Neither one of my parents are in any way. I was raised in a very there were no prejudices in my household. There were no racial pejoratives. There were no suggestions that any type of person was any better than any other type of person. Now, at the time, the sexuality and gender identity and all this kind of business wasn't even an issue, so that didn't really get brought up. It's not like I ever had a conversation with my dad where he said, "You better not be gay," but I'm sure in his head a few times the thought, "I hope he's not gay." I'm sure that occurred to him because of the era he came from. And that's you can't hold that against somebody, and if any of his grandchildren or nieces or nephews or anything were gay or had any of the anything like that, gosh, that sounds so terrible. I'm 43, you guys. I'm adjusting to things too. But if any of his grandchildren, nieces, nephews were gay or had any kind of gender identity, I don't want to say issues because that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. He would be accepting and loving. He wouldn't kick anybody out of the house. He would never, ever even think of doing something like that. And my mom, I mentioned my dad more so than my mom because my mom has always been loving and accepting of everything. But my dad, he is not a kick you out of the house person. He is, I'm going to understand this and we're going to keep going person. And it may take him a long time to understand things, but he's going to get there. So I got to give them a lot of credit for that. And speaking about sexual politics and identity and everything else, that was another place where pop music and MTV had such a huge hand in making me and probably most of my generation tolerant and able to pave the way for where things are now. You had Boy George, you had Madonna, you had Prince, you had all of these people addressing, George Michael, addressing sexuality and identity. And you saw these things, and sometimes they were shocking, and sometimes they were interesting, and sometimes they made you feel feelings you didn't quite understand. And, when I said Michael Jackson was important, all of these people were important. You have to go back. I gotta pause for a little sip of water here. I realize I skipped right over our typical interstitial music, and I'll make that up to you later on in the show. But when you go back and you look at these artists in the 80s, and sometimes they get kind of dismissed and brushed under the rug, and oh, they're silly, and oh, look at MTV videos, ha ha ha. But you've got to understand that these artists, for whatever reason they were making the statements that they did pave the way for the change that we're experiencing in the world now. Prince's ambiguity and androgyny, Madonna's outright sexuality, George Michael and the way he addressed sexuality with his videos, all of that stuff, people my age grew up seeing that, and it changed the progression of society. There's no denying that. So, on the one hand, it's pop culture fluff, but on the other hand, this is how the world changes, is through art. So, to continue on my own personal journey, after taking a little sidetrack to get deep there, before I was done with cassettes, I discovered heavy metal. Thanks to MTV and staying up very late at night whenever I could. And I wish I could remember the first metal I heard. I wish I could tell you what video, what band, whatever. I don't know. What I do know is the first metal band that I was passionate about and that I was a fan of was Metallica. They got huge and were everywhere. And the first... Oh, I totally skipped over the first live concert I ever went to, although I've talked about it on the show before, so I'm not going to go too deep into it now. You can go back to the Beastie Boys episode from a couple of years ago and hear the story if you'd like, but my dad took me to see Run DMC and the Beastie Boys. I have been saying for years that it was the Houston Astrodome. It was not. It was at a different venue in Houston, which I discovered recently going through, there's a website, setlist.fm. It's a great website. If you go there, you can find just about every major concert ever, and find out what the set list was very often, find out the venue, the date, that sort of thing, because I've got ticket stubs from a lot of the shows that I've seen, but not nearly as many as I thought I had. So if you go to setlist.fm, you can track down so much information about live shows, and it was through that I discovered that Beastie Boys Run DMC show was somewhere other than the Astrodome. But it is still a fact that my dad took me, and it is still a fact that I was very uncomfortable at the Beastie Boys live show in 1987. So the next show that I saw, the next concert that I went to, was also the very first concert that I went to unaccompanied by parents, with just me and my friends. And we went and saw Metallica at the Omni. And this is another one where I've had to sort of figure some things out, but it was either 1990 or 1991. I can't remember right now, but it is, I had a post, top 10 best concerts on needlessthingspodcast.com, or actually, at this point, I think it's on oldneedlessthings.com. So if you go to oldneedlessthings.com, which is where the previous Needless Things is archived, you can find all the old articles from the past 10 years there. But there's a top 10 concerts ever, and that Metallica show that I went to with my friends, we were, way up. We weren't close to the stage at all, but we went on our own, and your old pal Dum Dum Dave bought a t-shirt that I could have bought from like Spencer Gifts the next day if I wanted to. And I don't know why I didn't like tour date shirts. For some reason, for years, I would not buy concert T-shirts that had tour dates on them. I can't explain it to this day. I think back and remember specifically not wanting tour dates. I don't know. I don't know, you guys. It was dumb. It was stupid. So I still have the shirt I bought at that show, and it's I still love the shirt. It's Don't Tread on Me. But it's it's a pus head designed snake of a Mobius strip. Very interesting shirt, but no tour dates on it. So dumb. Anyway, saw Metallica live, and it blew my mind. The Beastie Boys Run DMC. Oh, how is there not a cover band called Run DMC? I'm sure there is out there. The Beastie Boys Run DMC show was one thing. I was 11 years old. I was with my dad. It was very uncomfortable, and it was incredible seeing those guys up on stage, and it was a very different experience from listening to the album, obviously, because the album is yes, there's a lot of filthy innuendo. There's a lot of reference to drug use. There's reference to walking around with guns, having a gun making you a big man or whatever. Like a lot of immature bullshit that, again, I don't think you can hold the modern Beastie Boys responsible for what the 18-year-old Beastie Boys were doing in 1986. That's a little ignorant and stupid. But there are a lot of bad messages in that album. It's fun, and it's hilarious, and it's ridiculous. And if you read Beastie Boys' book, which you absolutely should, you see what their mindset was at the time. But there was no profanity. There's certainly no overtly offensive things to an 11-year-old, but then to see the stage show live with your dad sitting next to you, with half-naked girls in cages at the front of the stage, King Ed Rock walking over to the monitor and flipping it off every 30 seconds. Like, that experience, I cherish the memory, but it was uncomfortable and overall not a great experience. Metallica, on the other hand, seeing these guys play for 2.5 hours, just working I have never seen a band work as hard as Metallica did, and at the same time, very obviously, we're loving every minute of it. It was just incredible, and obviously it cost a lot of money to go see Metallica live right now, but I do highly recommend everybody check out that Binge and Purge box set. I'm sure you can find the videos on YouTube at this point. I'm sure you can find plenty of Metallica live videos. Check out Metallica live. If the only way you can do it is online, I absolutely understand that. But just to see these guys practicing their craft is absolutely incredible. It's mind-blowing. And it blew my mind, and it set me down a path where not by any means did I leave Beastie Boys and Run DMC behind, or Weird Al. They definitely, my fandom was just as strong for those guys over the next several years as it had been since I found them. But it did put a new fork in my road, or not a new fork in the road, but just added a new layer, I guess, to my musical journey. And that metal became what I was about. And that led to the next band that I would say I found, or I decided to love sort of on my own, because in their own way, Metallica was almost like Michael Jackson as far as being that age, being a young man, you were going to be a Metallica fan. And the Black Album had just come out and was one of the biggest things ever. So you just kind of were into Metallica. You just were in the early 90s, in 1990, 1991, whatever it was. But then Anthrax, well, and you know what? Now that I'm saying 90, 91, it was actually And Justice for All was where me and my friends all sort of became Metallica fans. Because this next band I chose on my own, so to speak, Anthrax. I know I was listening to before Persistence of Time came out, which was 1990. So that would have been prior to seeing Metallica live. But Anthrax was another band that I made a choice to love. Gosh, surely I wasn't listening to Anthrax in 1987, which would have been when, let's see, State of Euphoria was 88. I guess it was right around State of Euphoria would have been when I discovered Anthrax and realized that they were my guys. That, yes, I loved Metallica, yes, I loved Megadeth, but Anthrax spoke to me. They were a little more fun. They did songs about Stephen King books and about Judge Dredd, and didn't seem to take themselves quite as seriously as the other metal bands that were around at the time. So I adopted them, and they were my guys, and I absolutely loved them. And that whole metal thing, it was an interesting scene at the time, because there was a lot of music that kind of went along with metal. Like, I listened to Metallica and Whitesnake, and I never liked that stuff, like Whitesnake and Mr. Big and Warrant, which I guess predates Metallica becoming as big as they were, because I did kind of skip over the whole hair metal thing. That stuff, I listened to it. I'm not going to lie. I watched the videos. I listened to it. I never owned a Poison tape. I never owned a Motley Crue tape. Warrant, like all of that stuff. I never owned any of it. I did own a couple of Bon Jovi tapes, for sure, which is funny to me, because 43-year-old me looking back, Motley Crue is way cooler than Bon Jovi. But in my mind at the time, Bon Jovi was cooler, and maybe, I don't know, I can't explain it at all. I have absolutely no reasoning for that. But the hair metal thing, I watched the videos, I listened to it whenever it was on or whatever, but it was not my bag. I didn't want to buy that music. So my friends that did listen to Metallica and Anthrax and later on Slayer, because Slayer was a whole different thing. You got to understand, in the late 80s, early 90s, the openly professed or open satanic imagery, I guess, whatever you'd say, Slayer seemed dangerous and scary. Like, they seemed legit. It wouldn't, if you had told 11, 12, 13-year-old me that Slayer, like, murdered people on tour, I probably would have believed it. You know, I come from the generation where it was taken as fact that KISS stood for Knights in Satan's Service, that's just what it was. So you got to understand that it was a different time. No internet, no verification of facts, urban legends and pop culture stories and that sort of thing. You sort of took what you could get, and your buddy down the street, maybe he had a source of information you didn't know about, so when he tells you something like AC/DC stands for After Christ the Devil Comes, you just kind of take it and believe it, because they're weird Australian dudes, even though their videos are strangely inoffensive and sexy. So we seem, at this point, I feel like I've kind of hit the CD era, and maybe I leave the CD era for another day. I had thought, honestly, that in an hour's time I could cover from what I'm thinking of as from the Muppets to Ghost, because that's essentially my musical trajectory. From, you know, listening to Muppets albums as a child to a couple of years ago discovering Ghost and them being the first new, like, big band that I truly loved in the last, like, decade almost. I thought I could cover that in an hour, and it looks like I was wrong. Instead, what I've managed to cover is those first records of the Muppets, and then also on vinyl. We didn't call it vinyl back then. They were all just records. Men at Work, Michael Jackson. Never had any Prince records. Beverly Hills Cop soundtrack was a big one. All that stuff. Up through the cassette era, listening to all that stuff on my Walkman, just wearing out. I remember one time at Boy Scouts, I was listening to Are You Ready for Freddy by the Fat Boys really loud, because I love that song. I loved it. I loved Freddy Krueger. I loved Nightmare on Elm Street, and I mean, I liked the Fat Boys a lot, but they had, they did Wipeout, and Are You Ready for Freddy, I believe, might have been on the same album. And I would rewind and listen to those songs over and over and over and over and over again. And I can't, now that I'm thinking about it, I can't remember if the Fat Boys did the Twist or Wipeout first. I think the Twist might have come first. But whatever the case, I remember listening to Are You Ready for Freddy super loud. And one of the Boy Scout leader guys asking me if that was okay and if I needed to turn it down a little bit because he could hear what I was listening to. And I just didn't think it was all that loud, and I'm sure it was, and I'm sure I damaged my hearing from listening to it. So yeah, those cassette days, the last few cassettes that I got, as a matter of fact, I know for a fact the very last cassette that I bought was Anthrax Attack of the Killer Bees, which is a collection of B-sides and outtakes from, I think, Spreading the Disease and Persistence of Time. And it's great, and it's where Anthrax's probably best-known song of all time, their collaboration with Public Enemy, Bring the Noise, it's where that came from, or it's what album that was released on. And I listened to that so many times. And I will tell you the story the next time I get back to these musical reminiscences, which I may try to have... I may try to have a guest on next time to have somebody just sort of go back and forth with And we'll see what future installments end up bringing. I can tell you the next episode, though, will be about CDs and how my dad was an insane CD purist from the very moment that CDs started coming out, and that I wanted to have nothing to do with them. But we'll have to cover that in the next installment. I don't know when it'll come. I don't know what it'll be about. But I will say this. I am visiting my parents in good old Wilmington, North Carolina, in just under a month. And if I can convince my dad to come back on the show, we will talk about CDs and the CD revolution. And I'll share some memories of how that went down and why Anthrax Attack of the Killer Bees was the very last cassette I ever bought. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this look back at my own personal musical history. Music means a lot to me. It is my constant companion. I actually get a little bummed out about podcasts sometimes because it means I'm listening to music less in the car than I used to. But I will tell you right now, I'm getting ready to wrap this thing up. I'm going to walk over to the record player, and I'm going to put on Anthrax's new album of covers called Anthems, and listen to that and probably a couple more albums before this day is done. So music has been, and always will be my constant companion. And I think it's a universal form of communication in a way that very few things are. And even if we don't all love the same things, we can all appreciate the energy and the passion that goes into creating the music that we love. Like, even if somebody doesn't like the music that you like, you can appreciate the fact that they've gone to shows, they've got favorite artists, that there's a certain, again, it's one of those connections of fandom that brings us all together and makes us all as humans understand at least a little bit of what each other are about. So there you go. And now, in the spirit of sharing music, I'm going to play a little something for you from our pals, the KBK, which you can find on Facebook and at deepeddy.net. Under Kill Baby Kill, or also the KBK. They were formerly known as Kill Baby Kill, but as we get older, we realize maybe that's not a nice message to send. Maybe we should call ourselves the KBK, which I think is pretty much what happened there. So please enjoy, since we're getting ready to start another needless summer, Psycho Beach Party by the KBK.
They shall all drown in lakes of blood. Now they will know why they are afraid of the dark. Now they will learn why they fear the night.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that fun trip down memory lane. I didn't really expect it to be what it was. I honestly thought I would cover Muppets to Ghost in the span of an hour, which was probably foolish. So look for, in all likelihood, 2 more editions like this. One that will discuss the CD age and one that will discuss the digital media age, because I think that's kind of how these things are going to break down, because today was mostly cassettes with just a dab of vinyl. Well, I guess we'll start with vinyl and we'll end with vinyl, won't we? I hate myself every time I say vinyl. We'll start with records and we'll end with records, I think. But and then also the other music-oriented project that's going to take a little bit longer to put together than I thought, but that's okay, because I think the best things do. The best things take a little bit of effort to put together. So there you go. I did not mention my shitbag neighbors have moved out, so that's fantastic. They're horrible people who were, while we didn't interact with them directly very often, they were very invasive in our lives, from the reek of marijuana coming from their lawn to their extremely loud profanity to their parties at odd hours to the ridiculous bass music that we could hear over our television. And there's not really a whole lot you can do about that sort of thing, it turns out, unfortunately, except to wait for them to leave. And now they're gone, and fuck them. I hope horrible things happen to all of them. Boy, that's not a good way to end things, is it? That was an instance where music did not bring us together. But I hope you guys have great neighbors. I hope you have musical experiences that enrich your lives and the lives of those around you. And always remember, as long as you're not those neighbors, I love you guys.
Thank you for listening to the Needless Things podcast. You're the best. You can find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, Downcast, or in the ears of a Trader Vic's employee. Love you. Mean it. Uh-huh.